Better remember to start recording on my screen as well. I was amazed it's 10 years since I last spoke here, and I came back a couple of years after that to hear Jean-Pierre Cavallero give a talk on DNA, about which I knew nothing coming into the talk and still knew nothing coming out of the talk. But a couple of years later I went to some of Maurice Gleason's talks, and you've had Maurice here I think more recently. And suddenly it all began to make sense, and I started to learn a little bit about DNA, and I hope to pass on a little of what I've learned tonight. If you want to follow along my notes or look at them afterwards, they're up on my website, pwaldron.info/GSI. That's uppercase GSI, it's case sensitive, and you can follow all the links that I mightn't have time to go through today. And hopefully between your new equipment and myself, we get an online version of this talk up as well. I have a box of kits here. If you haven't swabbed with family tree DNA, and if I convince you that you should, one of the rules is no eating, smoking, drinking, chewing gum, or washing your teeth for an hour before you swab. So don't be eating during the talk if you think you're going to be swabbing at the end of it. So I'm going to talk today about the Y chromosome, the Y DNA that follows the male line from father to son, like the surname, and explain how anybody who wants to can apply to family tree DNA to set up a surname project. If there's no surname project already in existence for your surname, there's about 10,000 surname projects out there. There's probably another 100,000 surnames around the world still crying out for a project administrator. And I'll talk about the tools available to project administrators and what you can learn about the origin or origins of your surnames by administering a project or participating as a member in a project. People have been doing surnames for a long time. I think there's a connection between this society and the Guild of One Name Studies that usually seem to share stands at Back to Our Past and things like that. That was established in 1979. There was no direct-to-consumer DNA back in 1979. That first became available in the year 2000, thanks to family tree DNA, and it started out with analysis of the Y chromosome. But autosomal DNA analysis came along in 2007, and the Y chromosome has become the poor relation ever since then. I'll explain all these differences in a minute. But first, some of the questions that you might be able to answer about your ancestors by looking at Y chromosomes. You might have two men with the same surname or similar surnames, and they might wonder, are we related, or how are we related? Do we descend from a most recent common ancestor who had the same surname that we have? Or did the surname evolve completely independently in our two male lines? When did our most recent common ancestor live? Was it within the Surname Era? And here in Ireland, when we talk about the Surname Era, we think of Brian Boru and the O'Briens, who claim to have the oldest hereditary surname in the world. Some of them claim it anyway. And we probably all know, even if we don't live in Killaloe, where Brian Boru lived, that Brian Boru died at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. So I date the Surname Era to approximately the year 1000 AD. Two men might know when did their most recent common male line ancestor live? When was the present surname first adopted by my ancestor? How many centuries back was the first Waldron to whom I might be able to trace a direct line of descent? We all go back to an unknown man who's been called the genetic Adam. And when Y-DNA was first analysed, somebody came up with this scheme of what are called haplogroups. A haplogroup is just a group of men with a similar Y chromosome. We all descend from Y Adam, who lived about 150,000, 200,000 years ago. He wasn't the only man around at the time, but he was the only man around at the time whose male line descendants have survived down to the present day. If you think through your own family tree, think through all your grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, there will be many of those surnames where there's no living male in your family with that surname today because somebody had only daughters, or the sons didn't marry, or whatever, and the surname died out, but the lines of descent through a combination of males and females have survived. So after Y Adam, one of his descendants had a genetic mutation which divided the tree of mankind into two branches. One is haplogroup A, and the other one then divided with another mutation many generations later into haplogroup B and all the other haplogroups, and so on. More and more mutations have happened. And when this tree was first put together 20 or 30 years ago, they didn't even need all the letters in the alphabet. They only went up to the letter R. Now there are hundreds of thousands of these mutations on the tree of mankind. Most Irish men are over in this very extreme right-hand branch, the R1b haplogroup. About 80 to 90% of Irish men are over here, and you can assign continents, roughly speaking, to each of the other letters as well. So let's look at what that tree with 18 branches has become over decades of analysis of the Y chromosome. There's now 16,000 branches, 118,000 variants, 160,000 confirmed SNP mutations, and it takes forever to load up, but eventually it loads up. So across the top you have the original haplogroups up to R, and S and T have been added in since that early version. So just to show you where most Irishmen are, within haplogroup R, somebody had a mutation which has now been given the label M207. Then there were two descendants of that with other mutations. Each mutation gets a label, a letter, and a few digits after it. And within the family tree DNA customer database, there's over 9,000 men who belong to this R branch. 9,303 belong to the main branch as we go down along. Almost 8,000 belong to the M343 branch. Then some generations later there was another mutation, L754, which almost everybody has. And then this next one, there's still almost 8,000. And eventually we come down to M269 here. And that's typically when you send off your first DNA sample for the cheapest test, the Y37 test, 80% of Irish men will be told you belong somewhere to this M269 or R1b branch of the tree. And you can see flags over here to indicate the countries that all these people come from. 959 out of those 8,000 or so from England, 558 from Ireland. That means that our most distant known male line ancestor came from this country. Germany next, Scotland, unspecified parts of the United Kingdom, France, Spain, United States. So originally these people lived in Northwest Europe. A lot of their descendants have crossed the Atlantic and don't know exactly where in Europe the ancestor came from. Bit of Italy and so on down along. So if you send off your Y-DNA for analysis, you want to know where in this big tree of 160,000 mutations does my surname and my family belong. So how come we have all these different Y-DNA signatures? The Y chromosome goes from father to son, usually completely unchanged, but every few generations there might be one or two little mutations. And when you build that up over a couple of 100,000 years, that gives a very large distribution of different Y-DNA signatures that are out there today in the general population. I've talked about the Y-atom at the top of the tree already, and that's called the tree of mankind. We want to figure out where does my surname fit on that big tree. So I'm going to talk briefly, I'm going to remind you of the other components of DNA just so that you know how Y-DNA differs from what Ancestry markets every day. Talk about the connections between surnames and the Y chromosome. Talk about family tree DNA, which is the biggest company by far in the Y-DNA business, and the other competitors. Talk about the types of Y-DNA projects that you might join or you might volunteer to administer. Talk about how to apply to set up a project, some of the tools that are available to project administrators, and then I'll spend about the last quarter of the talk going through examples of surname projects and telling you what people have learned about the history of particular surnames from Y-DNA projects. And there'll be a bias towards County Clare surnames because that's where I live and where many of my ancestors came from. So what is DNA? It's made up of chromosomes and the mitochondria, and if you send off a cheek swab or a saliva sample to a DNA lab, it will be turned into a big data file which contains long strings of the letters A, C, G, and T, which represent 4 chemical compounds that make up our DNA. Where does the DNA come from? We all start out as a sperm fertilizing an egg. From our father, the sperm will either bring a Y chromosome or an X chromosome. If the sperm has a Y chromosome, you end up male. If the sperm has an X chromosome, you end up female. You also get your 22 paternal autosomal chromosomes from your father. You get another 22 from your mother, and they stick together to form your autosomal DNA. That's by far the most of the DNA, but it is inherited 50-50 from your father and your mother, approximately a quarter each from each grandparent, approximately 1/8 each from each great-grandparent. So looking at that from a genealogical point of view tells you about ancestors on all sides of your family. The Y chromosome comes down from father to son. If we look at my pedigree chart in my genealogy software, my Y chromosome came from my father, who was also Patrick, from my grandfather, who was John, from my great-grandfather, who was Thomas, from my great-great-grandfather, who was another Thomas, like my Waldron surname. On the other hand, the egg has the mitochondria, so everybody gets the mitochondrial DNA from the mother. So I got mine from my mother Noreen Durkin, who got it from her mother Bridget Durkin, who got it from her mother Anne O'Neill, who got it from her mother, who was a Mrs. Mary O'Neill, maiden name unknown. So that's harder to trace because as you go down that all-female line, for most people the surname changes with every generation. In my case, my grandparents were both Durkin, so my grandmother didn't actually change her surname. The X chromosome is a little more complicated. It can come down through any line that doesn't contain 2 consecutive male generations. So just to look at this chart, the Y chromosome comes down the male line, which is the bottom left on the fan chart. The mitochondrial DNA comes down the all-female line, which is the pink line on the right-hand side of the fan chart. This is a male. He has 1 X chromosome, which comes from his mother, males in blue, females in pink. Parts of the X chromosome come from both of the maternal grandparents, except in rare cases where it's inherited entirely from one. And bits may come from any of the coloured squares as you go back through the generations. So can be used for some specific genetic genealogy puzzles, but we're not going to talk about it tonight. The autosomes are what you see advertised by Ancestry on the telly, what MyHeritage, 23andMe and others are using to find you cousins on all sides of your family. But today we're going to talk about the Y chromosome, which comes down to you, like your surname, down the direct male line. So if you're a male, you have a Y chromosome, you can send off cheek swabs to Family Tree DNA and they will extract data from the Y chromosome. If you're a female, unfortunately you don't have a Y chromosome, but hopefully you have a father or a brother or an uncle or a cousin or another male relative with the surname you're interested in. If you're a female, your son will have your husband's DNA, your husband's Y chromosome, not yours. So a lot of people seem to get confused when they hear you have to get a male. It has to be a male with the relevant surname. If you have close relatives who are interested in collaborating with you on a surname project, well, you don't both spend $650 each on the top of the range big Y 700 test, because you're going to get exactly the same results back if you're very closely related. So you're better off pool your funds and target the testing at 2 men whose relationship you're not so sure of. So the neighbour in the next townland with the same surname might be a more interesting person to get a DNA sample from than your brother, who's going to have virtually the same Y chromosome as you have. So there's 2 types of mutations that we look for on the Y chromosome: SNPs and STIRs. SNP is a single nucleotide polymorphism. The nucleotide is the chemical compound that gives you the letter A, C, T, or G. Single nucleotide means it's just one letter that changes. Polymorphism is a Greek word meaning more than one form. So most people might have an A at a particular location on the Y chromosome. Some people will have a C. That's a SNP. And the interesting thing about the SNPs that are useful for genealogy is these mutations are very rare. One man, sometime in human history, started out with an A and his son had a C in place of the A. All that son's descendants will continue to have the C. Everybody else in the world will continue to have the A. So the only people with the SNP mutation are the direct male line descendants of the first man who had it. every other man has the original value A rather than C in that location. And that's why you can build up a family tree of mutations so easily. When Y-DNA analysis started 20 odd years ago, first became commercially available 19 years ago, most of the analysis was based on a different type of mutation, the STR mutation. STR is a short tandem repeat. So there are places on the Y chromosome where you'll have a string like CCTG, and then that will be repeated again and again and again, maybe 7 times. And at some stage in the history of your male line, there will have been a mutation maybe where that changed from 7 repeats to 8 repeats, or 7 repeats, well, from 8 to 7 or 6 to 7, or might jump by more than 1 on occasions. And those were the types of mutations that were used to look for close relationships. So let's look at what sort of results you get back after you send off your DNA for analysis of the Y chromosome. This is my current results. I've had 111 STR matches analyzed, STR markers analyzed. There isn't another man in the database who has within 10 out of 111 differences from me on those markers. So that's a little bit disappointing. I have a unique Y chromosome. So let's look at, if we drop down to the first 67 markers, and I blacked out some names here because people have got paranoid, especially since GDPR, about privacy. So we can tell you the person's surname, and the earliest known ancestor is a deceased person, so data protection does not apply to that column. So these are my matches on the first 67 STR markers. This first gentleman, Mr. Cheney, he's done the 111 marker test. He doesn't match me. He's not within 10 out of 111 of me. The genetic distance column, the first column, is the number of differences between my 67 markers and the other man, Mr. Cheney's 67 markers. So I know we match on 64 of the first 67. We don't match on at least 8 of the next 44 because he's not within 10 out of 111 of me. So I have 2 matches within 3. This guy is not showing up on 111 because he's only bought the 67 marker test. This guy's only bought 67, this guy's bought 111. The FF here means they've bought the family finder test, which is the autosomal DNA test. And the big Y is the top of the range Y-DNA test, which looks at all the SNP mutations as well as the STR mutations. Only one of my matches has done that. So that's why you've got a number here. The big Y is now looking at 700 STR mutations, but only the first 111 are still being used for this matching process. You're expected to fill in the details of your earliest known ancestor. You get 50 characters to squeeze in as much biographical information as you can. The name, the dates of birth and death, and the location if you can. Some people have done it, some people have just put in a name, some people have left it blank. Most people have the same surname as the most distant known male line ancestor. This guy is Davis without an E. His most distant known male line ancestor is Davies with an E. Slight difference, Cantley and Cantley. But this guy, his surname is Clark, but his most distant male line ancestor is Dannison. So somewhere between Mr. Clark, who sent in the DNA, and Thomas Dannison, born in 1810, there has been a surname DNA switch. A man got a different surname from his biological father's surname. I'll go through the possible causes of that in a minute. Over here then you have a prediction as to your most certain SNP mutation. I showed you M269 on the tree. That's the mutation 80% of Irish men have. And over here, if people have bought any SNP tests, you'll see the result of the SNP test in this column. And it's called the terminal SNP. That's a little misleading because A, they mightn't have bought all the possible SNP testing and they might not have been tested for some more recent SNP mutation, or B, at some stage in the future, a new mutation might be found and you have to have at least 2 or 3 men to have the mutation before it's recognized as a SNP to go on the family tree. So this may change if a more recent mutation is found and this man has it. And then in the last column, You have the cardinal sin committed by some genealogists, which absolutely drives me mad. A date written in an all-numeric format. Luckily, all these matches happened after the 12th of the month. But if I was matched with somebody today, half the world will think when I write 2/12 that I mean the 2nd of December, and the other half will think that I mean the 12th of February. Never, ever write an all-numeric date in any work of genealogy, because somebody on the other side of the Atlantic will turn it into a wrong date. And unfortunately, family tree DNA haven't learned that lesson yet. And then one of the projects I run is the Clare Roots project, which is for anyone with an ancestor from County Clare. And as part of that, I try and line up the people who join the project into their positions on the tree of mankind. And eventually, I hope this page is going to load up. Look up. It was working perfectly earlier. Come on. Close it and we'll try again. We'll turn off the dongle and turn it on again. So we'll find somebody had a password for the local Wi-Fi there.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Maybe we should switch over just in case my dongle has died.
I don't want to broadcast this.
Can't hear you.
Put your finger in your ears, please.
Well, they won't see us typing it in.
I have it. Paddy. That's the code.
That's the code.
Yeah.
Which of the many networks is it?
That's a good question. Barry knows that.
Paddy, is it loaded? Turn around.
Actually, the page is loaded now in the background.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe we don't need it. Okay, so carry on. I'll remember that one for future. Anyway, this is what you see on the results page of a Y-DNA project. I have divided the members up into the various groups. The group names are arranged alphabetically. So the first letter in each group name is the top level haplogroup. So these are from haplogroup E. They're not your typical haplogroup or Irishmen. And the name I give to the project is the sequence of mutations in the order in which they occurred for these men. So some very distant ancestor tens of thousands of years ago had the M96 mutation. Maybe thousands of years after that, a man had the P147, then one of his descendants had the L499, and then one of his descendants generations later had P2, and so on. The first column is just the person's number from 1 up to 999 or however many I have. Then you have the kit number, then you have the surname, then you have the paternal ancestor name. And this is where it's very annoying if people don't fill in their paternal ancestor name. Then you have the haplogroup. The red ones are for people who've only bought the basic STR package and get a predicted haplogroup. The green ones are for people who have bought SNP products and have a confirmed SNP mutation identified. Then over here, for those 37 or 67 or 111 markers, you have all the values. For the first marker, everybody in that first group has a 13. The top line gives you the minimum within the group, the second line gives you the maximum within the group, the third line gives you the mode or the most common value within the group. The second marker, there are some differences. There are two 23s and two 24s in the group, so the minimum is 23, the maximum is 24. The mode, where it's split equally, seems to be the larger one, and the ones that are below average, below the mode, are highlighted in blue. Over here you have some 12s, 3 12s and a 13. The 13, the above average, is highlighted in red. So you can see, even though these people are in the same ancient haplogroup, there have been many STR mutations that distinguish between them in the thousands and thousands of years since haplogroup E was formed. And I've done the same down along. I'll show you similar tables for surname projects at the end of the talk. So I've talked about the once in the history of mankind nature of the SNP mutations. And I really don't know why people are still expected to start out with the 20-year-old STR mutation product. I think we should all be going straight into, 20-year-old STR, we should all be going straight into SNP testing. But SNP testing for some reason is still a lot more expensive than STR testing, and I think economics is the main reason that people still use the old STR product to get started. The other good use for the STRs is if you have somebody who might be a fourth or fifth or sixth cousin, there's probably not going to be an STR mutation distinguishing between the two fifth or sixth cousins, but there probably will be. There won't be a SNP mutation to distinguish, there will be STR mutations. So STRs are better for looking for very close relationships within the last couple of hundred years. SNPs for very distant relationships hundreds or thousands of years ago. What are the objectives of analyzing your Y chromosome? If you think you have a different surname from one of your male line ancestors, for example, if you're adopted, looking at the Y chromosome matches may give you a clue as to what your birth father's surname was. Or there might be a father or a grandfather or a great-grandfather who was adopted, and again, looking for different surnames among your Y DNA matches will give you a clue as to what the birth surname was. Or there might be just an unknown father. There might have been a single mother somewhere in your ancestry, and you might be trying to figure out who was the father of the child. Fill in the blank on the birth certificate or the blank on the baptismal certificate if there's an unknown father. You might be interested from a purely scientific purpose in looking at where do you fit on the SNP tree. You might be interested on whether your most recent SNP mutation is specific to your surname or is older than the adoption of surnames or occurs in other surnames. So here's my most recent SNP mutation, FGC 29367, and I will bring up the big tree, which is a third-party website run by a guy called Alex Williamson, who maps the SNP mutations to the surnames. If you've done autosomal DNA, you might have used a website called GEDmatch, which is a third-party site which has better tools than any of the labs that actually analyze the DNA. The big tree is like that. For Y-DNA, you download your data file from Family Tree DNA, you upload it to a data warehouse following the instructions up here, and this is if you have bought the top of the range big Y700 test, you get placed in this tree. So here I am. I'm in a different color because I've only done the big Y in the last few months and I'm not fully processed yet. And the other two men in this database with the same mutation as me are called Wade and Cheney. So my guess is, with three very different names like that, and no reason to believe that there's been a recent surname DNA switch, our common ancestor is probably more than 1,000 years ago in the days before surnames. And you can navigate up the tree by clicking the next one up, and we see there are two beaties. And roughly speaking, there's one of these mutations about every 100 years. So there's something like 14 or 16 there. So looking at the beatie side of it, you might say the common ancestor looks like it could be 1,600 years ago. Looking at the Waldron side of it, they've only found 3 mutations, so you could say maybe about 300 years ago. So split the difference, about 1,000 years back to the common ancestor between the Beaties and the Waldrons. And you can keep crawling back up the tree, see what other surnames are close. There's an anonymous person from the 1,000 Genomes Project and Aware with a common ancestor a few hundred years further back again. And back up to Y3001. And now you see there's a whole bunch of people over here with an unusual surname called Weakland. I've never met a Weakland. Anybody here ever met anyone called Weakland? So obviously there has been a concerted effort to get the Weaklands to join a Y-DNA project. And they all match with each other to a certain extent because they all have these two mutations, 820848 and Y134177 in common. But these three have a mutation that the other three don't have, 134174. So the first man who had that mutation almost certainly had the Weakland surname already. So that is a surname-specific SNP mutation. The same thing over here. These three all have 186974 and 188744 mutations. The other three Weaklands don't. So these two mutations almost certainly first occurred in probably two different men with the Weakland surname, maybe in the same man. And again, there's two more down here that that must have first occurred in a man with the Weakland surname. These two are descended from him. So these two guys know they're pretty closely related to each other. Then the guy over here is more distantly related, and the three guys over here are more distantly related again. So that's the ideal world where you've lots of men with the same surname and you find lots of mutations that occur in that surname and not in any other surname. Or you can be like me over here, where you have 3 different surnames and no mutation to distinguish between us. So it's the look of the draw, whereabouts you fit on the tree, and whereabouts you fit on the tree in terms of all the other people who are already in the database. So I have to go out and get lots of more Waldrons to test, but I'll tell you about what happened when I did that towards the end of the talk. So where were we? We might want to look at STR mutations that have happened since the most recent of those SNP mutations. Those last 2 weaklands at the bottom of the tree might then look at STR mutations to see how closely they are related to each other and give a more precise estimate when we come down near the present day. And you might want to look at traditions relating to the common origins of different modern surnames. The Irish Annals have some great historical accounts of how surnames originated. In County Clare, we have the Dalgash were the ancient people who inhabited County Clare. They were the descendants of a man called Cos, who lived sometime around 300 or 400 AD. And in the Annals we have this tree of the descendants of Cos in the first millennium AD or thereabouts, coming down to Brian Boru, who we mentioned earlier, and then down from about 1200 on to people who began to have hereditary surnames passed on from father to son. So according to the Annals, O'Brien, Considine, McMahon, Eustace, Kennedy, McGrath, Quirk, and all those other surnames have a common ancestor somewhere in the first millennium AD. So you would expect them to have similar Y-DNA signatures if the Annals are correct. And we have actually found that there is a mutation, the L226 mutation, which seems to come from Cos and is shared by many of the descendants with the traditional Dalgatian surnames. Similarly, up in the northwest, you've probably heard of Niall of the 9 Hostages, who lived around the same time as Cos, sometime in the first millennium AD, I can't remember the exact year. And there is a DNA mutation which is called M222, which is very common in northwest Ireland and in the surnames that, according to the Annals, descend from Niall of the 9 Hostages. So we think of M222 as being the Niall of the 9 Hostages mutation. And there's a couple of other big groups of Irish surnames which have been found to have a common mutation somewhere back in the first millennium AD, shared by the surnames. So in theory, you would hope that your match list would have lots of other men with the same surname. So I showed you mine already. There wasn't a single Waldron in sight. They all had different surnames. Left me totally baffled as to where I came from. But to show you what can happen if you're lucky, this is for a man called Flannery. Again, I've blacked out the Christian names for privacy reasons. His top match is a Flannery. His next match is a Flannery. And there's a cuckoo in the nest. A Kemple got in there somehow. And then there's a guy who still has the old Irish version of the name of Flannery. So this guy has no doubt he's a Flannery for generations back. But the problem is, none of them have filled in their earliest known ancestor. All of the Flannerys have only bought the very basic 37 marker test. Mr. Kemple is the only one who's bought the 111 marker and the family finder. And none of them have done any SNP testing. So the Flannery project was one of the very early Y-DNA projects in Ireland. It was very successful in recruiting people. It got all these state-of-the-art 37 marker tests done maybe 15 or 20 years ago, and nobody has really made any progress since in terms of fitting the Flannerys into the bigger haplotree, the bigger tree of mankind. And the other nice one is the Marnan project. Here's a Marnan man's results. The Flannery man had only done 37 markers. Lots of the Marnans have done 111 markers. They've all filled in their most distant ancestor, or the administrator, my cousin Cindy, who's up there in the audience, might have filled it in for them. And they all go back to places in West Clare, mostly to ancestors in the early 1800s, some to the early 1700s. but they can't find the single common ancestor. They're all within genetic distance 0, 1 or 2 of each other on the 111 marker scale. Those who have done SNP testing all have the same terminal SNP. They're very definitely related. There's very definitely, we thought there was only one genetic origin of the Marinin surname until the last week or so when we heard of a Marinin man who's still alive who took his surname from his mother. So if he joined the project, it wouldn't be a Y-DNA match to the Marinin men who took their surname from their fathers. And then you have a gap from genetic distance 2 out of 111 to the next match is genetic distance 7 out of 111. And then you start to see different surnames, Nichols, O'Donnell, O'Loughlin. And in the Marinin project, it looks like the Marinin surname might have first been adopted by an O'Loughlin who changed the surname maybe 500, 600, 700 years ago from O'Loughlin to Marinin, because the next closest matches all tend to be O'Loughlins, both in terms of the STR tables and in terms of these SNP mutations over here. So why do some people get those great results where everyone has the same surname and other people get results like me where everybody has different surnames? Well, maybe the surname just didn't proliferate. Maybe in the first generation of Marinins, a man had 6 sons and they all had 7 sons and they all had 8 sons, and suddenly you have loads of Marinins with the same Y-DNA, and maybe every Waldron had only a single son or 2 sons and lots of daughters, or only 1 or 2 children altogether. Maybe the surname has been daughtered out. I have a suspicion I descend from a Waldron who came across with the Ulster plantation in 1609. His family tree is very well documented, right down to the present day, mostly out in Australia and New Zealand now. There isn't a single male living Waldron descendant that I can get DNA from. All the living descendants come down through females at some point in the line of descent. So maybe that's why I have no matches with the Waldron surname. I do have one 12-marker match with my first cousin once removed, so I know at least that I am the great-grandson of my great-grandfather because I match one of his other descendants. But that's as far back as I can go. You may find there's nobody at all of your surname in the FTDNA database. You can do a search on many of the FTDNA pages. You have this project search box over here. That was a search for Geheran, which is an unusual Leitrim surname, and it comes back and says there is no customer of family tree DNA with the surname Geheran. There's only about 1 million customers, and it's a less than a 1 in a million surname. But in fact, I know there is a customer with Geheran DNA, because there was a big splash in the media about a year ago about a famous American sportsman, a baseball player called Jim Palmer. This is more probably GDPR getting in the way, but every second time I load that page that comes up or it doesn't come up, so we'll see what happens if I close it and load it again. There you can see the headline. Hopefully it'll stay there this time. He waited till he was 72. Well, he waited until his third wife decided she wanted to know who he really was. He was adopted as a child, and his search for his birth parents was made even more difficult because his adoptive father died when he was very young. His adoptive mother remarried, and he took the adoptive mother's second husband's surname. So that made it even harder to get his hands on his adoption records because he was neither using the surname of his birth parents nor the surname of his adoptive father. But they got in touch with various people in County Clare and eventually discovered that his mother was a Clare woman, his father was a Leitrim man, and his father's surname was Geheran. And at some stage, some other Geheran will join family tree DNA and say, that's weird, my only match is a perfect match with a Palmer, and then we'll figure out what the truth is. I went on the history show with Miles Dungan a couple of years ago to plug the Genealogy Ireland conference, and I managed to convince him after the programme to swab, and he's never really come back to me for any more information. But I looked about a year ago, there were only 11 Dungans out of the 1 million customers. Now it's gone up to 14. And I think when I looked at his matches, there weren't very many Dungans among his matches, but that's because there's not very many Dungans out there for him to be compared with. So a lot of what your matches look like depend on there being concerted efforts to recruit men of your surname, or no concerted efforts to recruit men of your surname, or concerted efforts to recruit men with a related surname. So lots of allochthons are going to find they have lots of Marinin matches because we've recruited all the Marinins, but the allochthons haven't been so heavily recruited. You may see that there are 14 Dungans in the database, but they may be all females or may have only done autosomal tests and not be in the Y-DNA part of the database. Or you may have very few matches because there have been a lot of recent mutations that separate you even from your close cousins. If you've had 4 mutations in the last 3 generations in your line, then you're not even going to match your own first or second or third cousins, because 4 out of 37 is the cutoff for declaring a match. Or you may come from a line with very few mutations since the adoption of surnames, so you might still be only 4 out of 37 away from a man with a completely different surname and 1,000 or more years back to the common ancestor. Or you could suffer from what's called convergence. You can have 2 men who lived 2,000 years ago with very different DNA signatures, but the mutations in their descendants have brought the descendants much closer than the ancestors were, and that will give you spurious matches. There may have been a surname DNA switch. It may be something you know about, it may be something you don't know about. I talked to one woman recently who was struggling to make sense of her matches, and it turned out that her parents raised 3 children who were fathered by the same other man that her mother had been having a long-running affair with while living with the husband. So that was a surprise. There may have been an adoption. You may have a surname which has multiple independent genetic origins. The common surnames like Kelly and Murphy have lots of different genetic origins. The rare localized names like Marnin and Talty and so on in County Clare tend to have only a single origin and much better matching. The surname may have mutated, the spelling may have mutated. We saw a Davis and a Davies earlier. We'll see some more of those in the examples at the end. Or it may be a question of translation. You may be a rabbit and your DNA matches may be Cunnians, because some ancestor way back translated the name from Cunnin to rabbit, and some other ancestor in another branch just anglicised the name from O'Cunnin to Cunnin. Or Judge and Brehony are 2 other names in Mayo that are interchangeable because Brehab is the Irish for a judge. The computer age has put an end to spelling diversity. Spelling didn't matter until computers insisted that we all spell our name the same way. Anyway, that is more or less repeating what I said before. The surname DNA switch used to be described as an NPE, and that was short for non-paternity event, and then people realised that doesn't make sense. There's always paternity when there's a child born, so now they talk about not the parent expected. But surname DNA switch is a much more accurate way of describing what happens when the Y chromosome doesn't descend in the same line as the surname, or more precisely when the surname doesn't descend in the same line as the Y chromosome. So why could you have surname DNA switches? You can have adoptions, you can have foundlings. My closest match when I started DNA about 5 years ago was a foundling who was, she's now in her 80s and a great-grandmother, and thanks to DNA, only in the last year has she figured out who her father and mother were. Her story's online. I won't have time to go into it, but you can follow that link if you want to read it. I talked about infidelity a minute ago. Some children take their mother's surname, maybe because the parents aren't married. Some children take a stepfather's surname, but they still have their biological father's Y chromosome. Some people, especially in the aristocracy, are asked to change their surname in order to inherit a family estate or a family fortune. Some men go on the run and want to hide from their past and change their surname. Who knows whether that happened in your ancestry 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 generations back. And it's a bit like grants of arms. Just because you share a surname with somebody doesn't mean you're entitled to bear the same arms that their ancestor was awarded centuries ago. So let's go on to the technicalities of dealing with the DNA companies and the DNA labs. There's not really much competition as regards Y-DNA. Ancestry.com, as you know from the television advertisements, I'm sure, has devoted millions into marketing autosomal DNA. It went out of the Y-DNA business back in 2014. The database that was online evaporated. I'm not a fan of cloud computing, so I think of when something disappears out of the cloud, it's a bit like the cloud evaporates, and it happens far too often for comfort. And there was a row. They wanted to destroy the actual Y-DNA samples, including Y-DNA samples from deceased people who had no surviving male line relatives, which is really destroying our history. I can't remember whether they actually went ahead and did it, but certainly it was delayed because there were a lot of lobbying to stop them doing it. There's a company called YSEC, which can be recommended because it does SNP tests for $18, which cost you $39 with family tree DNA. It's about the only other one that's competitive with family tree DNA. There was a site called YSearch, again a bit like GetMatch. GDPR came along and they decided we're scared of the European lawmakers, they're going to fine us millions, we're closing down. There was a site called worldfamilies.net. It didn't run a lab, but it hosted projects using family tree DNA data. It also decided we're closing down, we don't want to risk being fined by the data protection gods in Europe. And if you want to read about the other companies in the Y-DNA business, there's 2 pages on the wiki of the International Society of Genetic Genealogists, which list the relevant companies and what they actually do. So there's about 4 companies involved in one way or another in STR testing, and there's a few more in SNP testing. But family tree DNA is the only one that runs surname projects, and really a surname project is a natural monopoly. There's no point in having 2 Waldron projects and the Waldrons from that side of the room in one project and the Waldrons from that side of the room in another project and not being able to compare them. If you're not a family tree DNA customer, but you are with Ancestry or 23andMe or one of the other companies, there's a free autosomal transfer facility where you can download your data from the other company, upload it to family tree DNA just by filling in that form and following the instructions. And then they'll send you out swabs and they'll associate your Y chromosome results with your autosomal DNA results. If you've sent your cheek swabs in already to family tree DNA for Family Finder or Mitochondrial, they're in storage and they can be used, or if you send it in for Y37, you can use the same swabs that they kept in storage to upgrade to one of the more modern tests like Big Y700. If you're completely new, I have kits here and we can talk about swabbing at the end of the talk. I know this society is very much involved with the Irish DNA Atlas project, and I know some people who volunteered for that and were a little disappointed that they didn't get back a list of matches at the end of the day, or they didn't even get back a data file that they could upload to the online databases like GetMatch and Family Tree DNA. So you won't get a list of Y-DNA matches out of the DNA Atlas project. So for most people, if you want to do this, you start with the 37 marker STR product and then you decide what to do next. If money is no object, you start with the $649 Big Y700. But you can get more or less the same information for a lot less expenditure if you're judicious with what you spend. So when you start, you get a cheaper price if you go into a project. They're trying to encourage people to be parts of projects. There's the page listing all the projects. There's 10,312 projects that you can join. So if your surname is Moriarty, for example, you go to M and see is there a Moriarty project. There's 653 projects for surnames beginning with M. And they take a while to load, but eventually it'll load up the list and you can scroll down, or you can just do a Control F and search for Moriarty when it opens and see if there is a project. Come on, wake up. Give me a chance to wet my throat. Oh, operation timed out. That's not a Wi-Fi problem, that's a problem with too many projects out there on this for the server to throw out the list to us. Usually when that happens, it comes back in a few minutes.
Paddy?
Yeah.
Could I just clarify something you mentioned? It was quite justifiable, the comment you made about an awful lot of people, when they sign up for these various projects, they're hoping to get back their family tree, etc. In the case of the Irish DNA project, it was a research point, it was pointing towards research, medical research, and basically what they were looking for, the ideal cohort of 8.
Oh, I know what they were looking for, but I know
Yeah.
people who didn't get that message, even though you went
That's what, even though it was
out of the way to flag it.
Well flagged, yeah.
The other thing that I think annoyed some people is that we're told it would be unethical to be given back their own data file for use on another site. It was a very strange statement, I thought, from the College of Surgeons. I don't think anybody's more entitled to my DNA data than I am. Anyway, you get about $20 off the basic price. It's $169 for Y37 if you just walk in off the street. It's $149 if you come through a project. Plus shipping, it's $129 with a discount code, which I have if you get the kit here from me today. And you don't have to pay the $12 shipping.
Pleasure.
So what else can you do? You can really do it on the cheap. I did this, I had two men recently with an unusual Clare surname, Cahir. And there's only about 100 Cahirs in County Clare, or there's a few up in the north, and I think it's a different origin in the census in 1911. I said, your ancestors lived in the same parish, you have the same surname, it's a rare surname. I'm sure you're going to be quite closely related. So one of them did the big Y test, and the other one wasn't so keen to spend his money. And I said, we'll just do the very basic 12-marker test to get you into the system, and then we'll test you for the terminal SNP of the man who's done the big Y test, and I'm sure you'll match him. The 12-marker results came back, they only matched on 9 out of the 12. I said, you're definitely not as closely related as I thought. And then I had another look and I realized this other guy, he belongs to a completely different branch of the haplotree. He has the STR markers for one of the Munster groups of surnames, and for under $100 I had got him to his terminal SNP. And proved that there were two independent genetic origins of the surname Cahir in a small little area of County Clare. So we're almost ready to start going through the examples. There's a link to show you where you go to fill in the most distant ancestors. We saw in the match list, I'm going to log in as myself. In the match list, some people had filled in their most distant ancestors, some hadn't. In the project results page, some had, some hadn't. Everybody has to go to this page, click on earliest known ancestors and fill in who's your father's 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 father as far back as you can go. And down here on the direct maternal ancestor, who's your mother's 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 mother as far back as you can go. It's amazing the number of people who put a male name in here. They don't seem to understand the concept of mother's 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 name, or else it's not very well explained there. And there is a map-based system. I haven't found it very useful. On the same page you can fill in map coordinates for where your ancestor came from. So I have divided, as we saw, the Clare Roots people up into subgroups. I think there were 4 people in that first subgroup, and 2 of them have filled in the most distant known ancestor location, and there's one in North America and one in Ireland. And I much prefer to see numbers laid out in a table than maps. Other people would prefer the map interface. So you can set up a project which is surname specific. OD is one of the ones that I manage. If you're the project administrator, you can design the project homepage with text to tell people the history of the surname, encourage them to join, tell them what products to order, tell them to come to the next clan gathering. We had a big OD clan gathering in Ennis last May for the 700th anniversary of the Battle of Dysart OD. And we even have a special crest to commemorate the 700th anniversary. If anybody's driven through Lizzie Casey, they'll know the famous Fanny OD's pub. And you can put up information about background, goals, news, results, project statistics, break it down in any way you can. That's the sort of stuff I put on the homepage. How to participate, introduce yourself as administrator, tell them about the offline surname association and a bit about the surname history. I've shown you the Clare Roots project, and I've talked to you about the Dalcatian surnames. There is a haplogroup project for everyone with that L226 mutation, which is characteristic of the Dalcatian surnames. And there's some very good people running that one. There's a picture of Dromoland Castle, the home of the head of the O'Brien dynasty. And the lovely thing about this L226 project and the O'Brien surname project is we have the present Lord Inchiquin, Conor O'Brien, who still lives beside Dromoland Castle, and he has an unbroken pedigree going back about 32 generations to Brian Boru, and he was one of the early enthusiastic adopters of Y-DNA analysis and has been very supportive of these projects. And if you're an O'Brien, you can tell pretty quickly if you're an O'Brien with a confirmed descent from Brian Boru, or one of the O'Briens with many other independent genetic origins. After 1,000 years, not everybody with the O'Brien surname comes down in a direct male line from Brian Boru. There's bound to be surname DNA switches somewhere along the way. There are other county projects. The ISOG Wiki has a list of those that we know about. If there's any missing from that, sign up as a contributor to the wiki and stick them in or tell me about them. There are fears about data protection, and family tree DNA has gone through contortions over the last year or so because of GDPR, and a lot of things have got a little bit messed up. So when you join, you must make sure that you go into your project preference pages. There's all the projects that I'm a member of with the lists of administrators. And I can click here to say what sort of access I want to give to the various administrators. Tells you what the different level of access allows the administrator to see. Minimum access allows the administrator almost nothing. You might as well not be in the project as give the administrator limited. Give the administrator minimum. You should give at least limited. And if you really trust the administrator, you can give advanced, which allows things like downloading your raw data, editing your beneficiary information. If you fall under a bus tomorrow morning and you want your descendants to still have access to your DNA, you better have named a beneficiary or given the project administrator those rights. And down here, I'm co-administrator of this project with Mike Durkin, and I can set the access for each of us to advanced or limited or minimum, make it at least limited. I think new kits are now starting off as limited, but some people during the GDPR handover got screwed up. And down here, if you want to appear on those public results pages, you have to opt into sharing here just by sliding that back or forward. And you're pseudonymized. All that shows is your surname and your kit number. Your first name isn't shown on the results page. Similarly, on the privacy and sharing page, most administrators want you down here to set your Y-DNA matches to all levels so that they can compare your first 25 or your first 37 or your first 67 or your first 111 markers. And most projects' homepages will warn you about that. So how do you set up a project? Oops, there's a typo there. Existing, I can't spell. First thing you need is an email address, but the problem with this is the interpretation of GDPR is that the project administrator's email address goes on a public page which can be seen by everyone, whether a customer of Family Tree DNA or not, whether a member of the project or not. So if you put your email address on a public web page, you're going to attract lots of spam from people with 40 million in a Nigerian bank or trying to sell you Viagra or whatever. So I'm trying to convince them that they shouldn't be doing this. Wikipedia says a data breach is the intentional or unintentional release of secure or private confidential information to an untrusted environment. But putting my email address on a public page for spammers, to me, sounds like putting secure information in an untrusted environment. But FTDNA say, no, that's what GDPR tells us we have to do. I have told people for years, do not put my email address on any web page. Set up a separate email address if you want to do this, and you're just going to have to change it when it starts attracting spam. Then you fill in, once you have an email address you're willing to have published, you fill in an application form. I'm not going to do it here and now. Once your name, your email, your phone number, your kit number, you already have to be a customer of Family Tree DNA. You may be starting a new project and already be an administrator, you want to start your first project, or you may just say, I cannot find a group to join. There may be no Moriarty project and you want to set one up. And there's a few more questions. I recommend that you prepare the answers offline, because you might want to set up a second project and use the same answers later on, or just in case anything goes astray while you're filling it in, and just copy and paste into the boxes. There's a link to the terms and policies that you're signing up to. What do you get as an administrator? Well, administrators and project members get an activity feed. It's a discussion group, a bit like a Facebook group, where people in the project can ask each other questions about their DNA results, their ancestry, their surname, whatever. This is going to load up the activity feed for the Clare Roots project. And you can put pinned posts at the top to tell people how they should use the activity feed, but people don't read. And I looked at this earlier, the first thing was, this is a pinned post, please don't add any comments to this post. There's now 100 comments added to the post, which says in block capitals, please start a new discussion. Don't mix everything in here again. We're going to go slow. And it's probably going to time out on me. One more go. Everybody must be logging into Family Tree DNA this evening. Oh joy. Then you have the tools for editing the subgroups. I showed you the subgroups on the project page earlier, how I divide people up by haplogroup. You can divide them up by geography. You might put the Leitrim Clancys in one group and the Clare Clancys in another group and the Limerick Clancys in a third group, if you believe that they're of different genetic origins. I give up. The whole site is probably going to go down on me. I showed you the results page where they're sorted alphabetically. It helps to think carefully what you're going to call your groups so that they appear in the order you want on the results page. You can sort based on surnames if you have different surname variants. So for example, the Marnan project, we've let in a Murnan because people say Marnan and Murnan may come from the same Irish root. In fact, they have completely different DNA signatures, so they may have similar sounding surnames, but they're not genetically related. So we can keep them within the project, have a Marnan subgroup and a Murnan subgroup. Lots of little technical problems, which I won't bother going into. Then we have the nice thing, the genetic distance calculator. You're deemed a match if you've bought 37 markers and you're within genetic distance 4. That's declared a match, and you will see everybody within genetic distance 4 out of 37 from you. The project administrator can see people out to 7 out of 37, and that's a big help sometimes in working out relationships that are just outside the standard threshold. So here's a guy I was able to identify as being Nile of the 9 hostages recently. He has only one match. His name is Markham. He's recruited lots of other Markhams to do autosomal DNA, and eventually I convinced him we've got to do Y DNA as well. So he's done it, but not the other Markhams. His top match is a Breen, who's genetic distance 4 away, who hasn't done any STR testing, but he's in the Clare Roots project, and he has close matches from Nile of the 9 hostages branch. And so are the next 3 matches within the Clare Roots project. They're genetic distance 7 away from Mr. Markham, but they're all 9 of the 9 hostages DNA, so I'm pretty sure the Markhams are also a Nile of the 9 hostages dynasty surname. And on the other hand, here are my own results. With my FGC 29367, I have no match closer than 29 out of 111. I come from one of the ancient haplogroups with the U106 mutation, which came after L151. All my close matches are from L151, but then from P312. So my most recent common ancestor with my closest matches are thousands of years back. So again, I must come from a line where everyone had daughters and there were no sons, or something like that. I have no matches based on surnames. I have no close matches based on DNA mutations either. And then you can edit the public website. How do you recruit people into your database? you can ask the group's administrator at Family Tree DNA to send out an email on your behalf to all the customers with your surname, asking them to join your project. So write something up saying, please come and join our OD project. We have a great OD clan association. We have reunions. We have a DNA project. We'll find you your hometown land in Ireland. Please sign up for our FTDNA project. You can look at the matches of your project members, and if there's somebody in my Clancy project who has 3 matches who have the surname Clancy who are not on the project, I can email them directly and say, please join the Clancy project. I see you match people who are already in the project. You can use a society like this to recruit people. There may be a surname organisation already. Clans of Ireland keeps a list of clans who run DNA projects, and you could ask them to put up your new project in that list. There's projects for O'Boylan, Bryan, Byrne, McCabe, Cassidy, Crowley. And if your surname isn't in there, join Clans of Ireland and ask them to add you to that list. Guild of One Name Studies may help. So let's end by going through some of the surnames that I have worked with, or some that might be of interest to people in this room. I talked about the Cahers, rare surname, 2 men, not Y-DNA matches. My great-grandmother was a Clancy, so I run the Clancy project. Again, I got a local shop front as the picture, wrote up a bit of Clancy surname history, and the results page is quite interesting. Clancy, according to the annals, evolved separately in Leitrim, in southeast Clare, what was called Traderie at the time around Newmarket and Fergus, and in northwest Clare in what was called Corkham Row at the time up around Doolin. And there are arguments as to whether the northwest Clare and the southeast Clare Clancys are related, but it's generally accepted the Leitrim Clancys are not related. So we have some strays. This first group is a single stray that doesn't seem to match anyone. Here we have a group where we have identified a mutation which is Clancy specific, BY81149. But the interesting thing here is not only has there been a DNA mutation, there has been a spelling mutation. I would never have thought when I saw a Delancey that he started life, or his ancestors started life as a Clancy, but he has a perfect DNA match with a Glancy with a G. Down in Clare we never say it's spelled with a G. I think of that more as a Leitrim spelling. But on the other hand, they're close to some of the other Clare surnames in this A933 subgroup, and some of them claim to be from Limerick. Some of the Americans who claim an ancestor from Leitrim aren't quite sure and maybe guessed at Leitrim because they found Clancy's in Leitrim. So that's a lovely case where we actually managed to identify a new mutation and to confirm that 2 quite different spellings were actually derivatives of the same original surname. This is a more typical Dalcashian Clare group of Clancys. Again, we have found this DC505 mutation, which is specific to the Clancy surname. This guy down at the bottom learned that mutation by doing the expensive Big Y test. This guy up here has an adoption in his line, so his surname is Cranell, but his ancestor is Clancy. And he just had to pay $39 to confirm that he had the mutation that cost the other guy $649 to discover. And I'm sure if we get around to ordering the single SNP test for everyone else in that group, they'll also have that DC505 mutation. Then there's another guy here who is also Dalcashian, but his common ancestor seems to be back before surnames. I like to put the string of mutations down to the present as the title of the project, so then I can see Z17669 is the most recent common mutation for those 2 groups. That's about 1500 years old. Probably the Clancy surname was adopted by 2 different men independently. The common ancestor is probably before surnames for those guys. Then these are probably really Leitrim Clancys because they had the Nile of the Nine Hostages M222 mutation. Some of them know they're from Sligo, some of them know they're from Leitrim. They're definitely not matching the Clare Clancys. Then we have these 2 guys from the Limerick Fishermen Clancys, perfect matches to each other, certainly in the markers that you can see there. but they seem to be very far away genetically from either the Clare or Leitrim Clancy's. So we've maybe something like half a dozen different genetic origins of a middle-of-the-road surname like Clancy. Then these guys got very excited. This guy with Clancy roots in Wexford is actually from the R1A haplogroup, which is much rarer than the R1B, which is 80% of Irish men. But what was exciting was that there's a huge Tucker project in America, and he's a close match to the Tuckers. And the Tuckers were never able to find any match back in Europe to explain where the Tuckers came from. As you can see, there's 2 differences out of 37 there between the Clancy and the Tucker. He doesn't match any of the other Clancys. Somewhere along the line we suspect there was a surname DNA switch either in America or in Ireland in the last several hundred years between Clancy and Tucker. Still haven't got to the bottom of that one. Then we've let in a few people to the project who have matches to Clancy's but different surnames, probably the most common ancestor before the Surname Era. And then we've lots of members of the project who have a female Clancy ancestor. They're not going to match on the Y chromosome with the other Clancys, so they go in this residual group down the bottom. How am I doing for time?
About 5 minutes?
5 minutes. We'll go through 1 or 2 more. We won't go through all of these. I showed you the Flannerys earlier. Hopefully the home page will load up. They have a home page on family tree DNA, but when you click on DNA results, they don't let anybody who's not a member of the project see the results table, which I think is very selfish. How are other surnames going to learn? Or I'm sure they have learned from other surname projects how to manage theirs, and they won't share their results. But actually the Flannerys are around for a long time, and they do still have an external website with their results up on it. So they're not too bad. Quite a lot, and it's the same general principle of laying out the STR markers, but some differences. Kelly is a very common surname. They have a good project. For some reason the main spelling is Kelly with an extra E, not the way we spell it in Ireland. Marnan, I showed you a Marnan man's results earlier. I should just be clicking on the results pages here. Some people just have a 1-line introduction page, some people have lots of information. But here are all the Marnans who have done their Y-DNA test, and you can see how closely they match each other. There's 1 marker where there are differences, there's 2 markers where there are differences, and if you scroll right over, there's a 3rd one. So how many Marnan men have we here? 1, 2, 3, 6 Marnan men, and all of them match on all except 3 of the 111 markers. That's, I think, quite remarkable when you think they go back to the 1700s, don't know who the common ancestor is, but they're sure he's there somewhere just over that brick wall, maybe in the 1600s. McNamara I took over when worldfamilies.net went out of business because I had a McNamara grandmother. Melican is another rare Clare name that has recruited lots of people, and they have found several Melican specific SNP mutations. Hopefully this will load up for me. We'll give up. I'll just say a few words. I thought Michael Merrigan might stay, and I might encourage him to set up a Merrigan project because he's joined the Clare Roots project. O'Brien is a great project because Lord Inchiquin is backing it. OD I'm running. The O'Garas have been going for a very long time. Maura O'Gara O'Riordan has asked me to come and talk to Clans of Ireland, but it's a bit like the Flannery project. They were state of the art in the year 2000 or 2001, and they really need to get into SNP testing. Since Tony asked me to come here, I said I'd see was there an O'Hara project, and there is, and there's lots of Harrows, which seems to be a variant. That one popped up straight away. Some of these projects, the group titles don't tell you anything. Group 01 doesn't tell you anything about why these people are grouped together. I wish they would put some information in the group name about geography, SNPs, spelling variants, something to tell me why they're grouped with each other. I have set up my own private project, which I just used to use for the convenience of switching back and forth between different kits that I manage. GDPR put an end to that because you have to go through even more hoops, but I have put some Irish Waldrons in here, which are rather interesting. Hopefully we'll be able to see. I have 4 Waldrons and a Whalen. They're the only 4 Irish Waldrons I know who have done Y-DNA. I know they don't match me because I don't have any Waldron matches, which is me. I'm the bottom one down here. L151 is my most recent common SNP with those 2. That's probably about 4,000 years ago to a common ancestor, long before anyone was using the Waldron surname. There's another guy here, that's R1A. The rest of us are R1B. It's maybe 10,000 years back to the most common ancestor between the first guy and the other 3. Definitely long before the adoption of surnames. But when I saw a Whelan match, who matched me on my terminal SNP before I did the big Y test, I need to update that. I said, could Waldron ever be a variant of Whelan, or Whelan be a variant of Waldron? At least they begin with W and they end with N. But I'm not so sure now because I have a SNP that he doesn't have. So again, we're looking at sometime before surnames for our common ancestor. So it's quite remarkable that you have 4 people with the same surname with no matches. So at the end, why should you submit your DNA? The more people in the database, the more useful it is. There are positive externalities for existing and future researchers, especially if you're a man and you get your Y DNA analysed. That's of great benefit to your female relatives who don't have the Y chromosome and wish they did for genealogy purposes, whatever, about for other reasons. And your descendants will be eternally grateful to you for leaving them your DNA, as we would have been grateful if our ancestors had left us DNA samples. And there are new developments on the horizon in those lines. There's a company in Australia which is now commercially extracting DNA from stamps and envelopes and things that our ancestors might have licked a couple of 100 years ago. So keep all those family heirlooms and you might eventually get some DNA out of them. And at the end is a list of further reading, and hopefully we'll see some of you in Belfast at the weekend at Genealogy Ireland 2019, where you learn a lot more about these subjects from people a lot more expert in them than I am. So thank you very much for listening to me. Any questions?
Thanks very much.
I think there is a little bit of time left for questions. That was pretty mind-boggling, to say the least.